Hello and welcome to another rail-grinding, kick-flipping, testicle-shattering episode of What Happened, the show that was always leading up to talking about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. So with that in mind, strap on a helmet, elbow and knee pads, and just shield yourself in as much shock-absorbing material as you can, cause your early aughts nostalgia is about to take a beating. In 1999, there pretty much wasn't anything for kids to do except play video games. You could go outside, but that was risky. Then suddenly, from out of nowhere, whoa, skateboarding! Wow, holy shit, shred it up! Indie Boznones, 180-degree Napster grabs! Skateboarding and skateboarding culture had been around since the 80s, but exploded in the late 90s due to a variety of complicated factors. But the main one was Pro Skater. You'd see kids placing candles around their boards, performing dark rituals to please their pagan god, the Hawk. This was bolstered and amplified when Activision and a little company called Neversoft, best known for developing, blessed the world with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, a PlayStation game that blew up the subgenre of extreme sports. It sold pretty good at first, moving around 800,000 copies in its first few months, but would go on to selling around 5 million copies in total. Yeah, there were a few earlier attempts that predated Mr. Hawk and his pro skating, but nothing captured the imagination and the wallets of impressionable kids than this first entry in what would become not just a video game franchise, but a goddamn dynasty. Tony was, and still is, considered the Michael Jordan of skateboarding, so at the time, if his name was on the box, well, it meant something, which is sadly diminished over the last decade or so. Anyway, let's get back on the course. What followed was 3 amazing sequels and even more amazing soundtracks. Hey, have you heard of this group from Pro Skater 2? Yeah, they're pretty cool. I think they work for Tony Hawk, probably. They're called Rage Against the Machine. The early Pro Skaters weren't just fun, accessible sports games. They were a gateway into all kinds of subculture like music, graffiti, and drugs. Not drugs. No. 15 main games carried the Hawk branding under the publishing arm of Activision. Get out of here, Disney Skate Park. And things started to maybe get off the rails around here. Neversoft were in a quandary, cause by like the 6th game or so, they were running out of things to do with skateboarding, including but not limited to, not actually skateboarding. Activision had mandated an aggressive, almost yearly schedule with the series, which might have, well, it was directly responsible for personal and creative burnout within the company. Therefore, in 2007, Neversoft petered out with the limply received Proving Ground, which continued the series' sales downtrend, before Activision mandated an aggressive yearly schedule for Guitar Hero, leading to everything I just said. Again. Then, in 2014, Activision did what Activision does, killing Neversoft and merging the company into Infinity Ward because, of course it would. Now, let's rewind a bit. Nope, no, that's too far. Okay, right here. Yeah. In 2002, Activision had put out a press release stating that they and the House of Hawk had re-upped their initial video game contract, extending it to a far-flung date that no one would ever live to see, 2015. This is going to be important later. Now, let's fast forward to 2008, with Neversoft now working in the Guitar Hero mosh pits, but with the Pro Skater deal still in effect, Activision Suits felt there was still blood to squeeze from this Hawk, and set to reboot the series with fresh new ideas. Now, this is where a new skater decided to roll into the park. Robomodo was, I'm putting emphasis on the was here, a new game studio based in Chicago, who is comprised of both former Midway and Electronic Arts employees who needed jobs. Why? Well, Midway closed down due to Midway, but EA Chicago? That's weird. They made Fight Night, didn't they? So I wonder why. The 7th generation was rough, y'all. Anyway, Robomoto were contracted to reinvigorate the Tony Hawk brand, but if Neversoft couldn't do it via various gameplay features or aesthetic changes, Activision felt it could be achieved via peripherals. Wait, did I say Activision? No. While their bad decisions are all their own, the idea of Tony Hawk Ride came from the Birdman himself. In 2007, Tony had apparently started thinking about a video game controlled via an actual board, no doubt somewhat influenced by the Wii's monstrous motion-controlled success just a year earlier. Or, Tony might have just remembered something he saw in an arcade from like 1997. Regardless, he brought the idea to Activision, and since neither they nor Robomoto had any experience in engineering peripherals, they then turned to the electronic wizards at Chicago-based Product Council. Who is Product Council, you ask? Well, the leading name in toothbrushes, toasters, and laundry baskets, and now motion-detecting skateboards for video game consoles. So, after an apparently extensive period of testing and optimization, I'll just have to take your word on that, Tony Hawk Ride cursed the PS3, the 360, and the Wii in November of 2009, and cost $150 with the shit board that didn't work. It was reviled by the game press and gamers alike, rightly so, because it barely functioned and had the distinction of winning several Worst Games of the Year awards. Sales-wise, though, it was actually worse. The game, which had been expensive due to the manufacturing of the board, sold just over 100,000 copies across all formats in its first month. The next part is pretty hilarious, not gonna lie. Everyone in Activision and Tony Hawk himself were so confident this was gonna be a massive Wii-sized hit that they already put into production a sequel to Ride, Shred, before Ride even ever came out. Due to the board and the idea of rebooting the franchise with a fresh new spin, Activision had invested a lot in this venture and were keen to ride it out. In a poorly aged interview with Entrepreneur, Tony Hawk said, "Everything is wireless now, and a lot of it is motion controlled, and I said to Activision, I think it's time to do a skateboard that you can stand on." That was your idea. That was my idea, yeah. Are you nervous about the November release? I'm scared to death about it, because I know how much is riding on it, how much Activision has invested in it. I brought this idea to them, and they've dedicated 2 years of development and research, but who knows how it'll do. It's a scary prospect, but I know it's good. It wasn't. Shred, however, while a slight improvement, was actually worse when it came to sales. And when Activision is concerned, that's the only thing that really matters. Shred released less than 1 year later and moved just 9,000 copies in its first week, something I don't even believe. This was also the year that Robomoto laid off 60 employees and even announced that Shred would be the last Tony Hawk related game they would ever work on. Yeah, they wish. These motion control gambits did not pan out, so it was time to get creatively bankrupt. Hey, Tony, Activision, all you guys, you tried your best.
And you failed miserably. The lesson is, never try.
So they did a complete 180 indie nosebone and decided to slap together Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD, which was not really Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD. And by that, I mean what Robomoto wound up making was not the first game you grew up with, but rather a homunculus style project that pulled just a little bit from like the first 2 games. However, it of course would lack the music you remember from the originals, have no local split screen, and run on a completely different wonky physics engine. It came off as more of a mishmash that didn't really please anyone. It still, however, was a bit better received than the motion control monstrosities, so, there's that. We are now in 2013, and it's been 3 swings and 3 misses, or 3 ollies and wipeouts for Robomoto, so things were, looking grim. They were surviving after the release of HD by working on these things, whatever they are. It was then that Activision execs were probably just sitting there and then looked at a calendar and said, "Oh shit, we better fart out another Tony Hawk before we lose the license," and thus Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5 was born. Not wanting to waste time to find a new developer, Robomoto were chosen once again, and they needed to make the best with what they had, and what they had was very little time and even less money. The announcement of the 5th game in the Pro Skater franchise was a media firestorm. Journalists from all over the world were invited to a venue that had all the panache and legacy the series deserved: Tony Hawk's Twitter. This was how the game was first publicly announced. Unfortunately, one of the earliest decisions, saddling the game with the lofty suffix of a numbered sequel, would of course come with equally lofty expectations that Robomondo were ill-equipped to deliver on. For perspective, this is like, say, right before Umbrella Corps coming out, Capcom would suddenly go, slap an 8 on there. If you decide to take a prestigious franchise that got diluted with tons of sequels and spin-offs, then suddenly decide to start numbering them again, you best be bringing your A game and, not your F game. Now, since the development cycle of THPS 5 was so rushed, most of the issues we'll be discussing will more than likely revolve around that, but a few of course will be due to the DC shoestring-sized budget. To help differentiate 5 from the past titles, it had a massive focus on an always online community, letting players wander around lifeless virtual skate parks. This is a neat idea on paper, but certainly a risky thing to be fooling around with on such a tight schedule, as it needs months of prototyping and testing. A hardy team to specialize in this type of online infrastructure is also a good thing to have, which Robomodo also lacked, especially since they had lost that 60 employees just a few years prior. So when public screenshots and trailers first started being released to the press, criticism was leveled almost immediately, and it kinda deserved it. The game looked like an HD PS2 title, and the fans of the franchise let both publisher and developer know what they thought. Featuring bland, blurry textures, stiff character models, and pretty basic level geometry, it didn't look much different than, say, Pro Skater 3 or 4. While there certainly could be a few reasons for this, it's logical to assume that Activision's insistence that the game be released on all consoles, and when I say all, I mean all, was chief among them. It was a cross-generational game, so that meant PS4 and Xbox One, but of course those plucky old-timers, the 360 and PS3 Triple, were also in the cards. Now, having a game release on all 4 SKUs in late 2015 has to be some type of record, or at least close to it. Also, you notice some notable absences here, like that there was no PC or Wii U version of Tony Hawk 5 at all. Simply put, there was no Wii U version because of the Wii U, but the omission of a PC build, considering there was one for Tony Hawk HD, drew ire from PC fans. Try not to be surprised there. So aside from all the technical and public perception issues, just lacking these versions also hurt the game from a completely different angle when it was already getting the business from all sides. So, due to having to release on old hardware, the engine that Tony Hawk 5 would run on would have to be similarly limited. Unreal 4 didn't even support the PS3 or the 360, so Robomodo had to default to what they used to make their last Tony Hawk title, which, as it turns out, was Unreal 3. Now, in a previous episode of What Happened, to make the porting process go as smooth as possible, you need to design for something called the lowest common denominator. In this case, that would be like the Xbox 360 or the 3DS, it doesn't matter. So yeah, much like KJ Inafune's crowdfunding disaster, spreading your project across too many formats will inevitably lead to some complications. Aside from the technical stuff, the failure of the last 3 Tony Hawk titles was also another big factor into why Pro Skater 5's announcement wasn't really met with applause. Some people even started to look back to the past and were able to dredge up the old press release from 2002, which convinced a percentage of fans that Tony Hawk 5 was one final hollow cash grab before the license expired, which, to be fair, was true. Now, the next red flag in a veritable sea of red flags is that 2 months before the game bailed onto store shelves, it suddenly underwent a graphical overhaul. Now, normally this would be seen as a good thing, but since this is what what happened, it wasn't. Yes, the graphics were indeed better, seeing a slight cell shading filter applied to the edges of the characters. A more colorful palette was also implemented, and various other smaller effects. However, this being so close to the release of the game, many people viewed it as a last-ditch 11th hour effort to impress on some type of level, since the graphics were so heavily shat on by a majority of fans and critics. Robomoto CEO Josh Chewy clarified why this change took place, at least from the developmental side. "We've always been confident in the look we were going for, but it took a while to ensure we could maintain the frame rate with this style. It was essential that the game run at 60 FPS at 1080p, even with 20 people skating online in the same session. We've achieved that, so now fans are seeing a better looking game. We pay attention to everything the fans are saying, but that isn't what drove the visual upgrade." So what you're saying is, roughly 2 months before the game shipped, you couldn't get it running at a consistent frame rate at a particular resolution, and that's what stopped you from adding more color. Now, while optimization is indeed the last thing that's done on most games, it didn't exactly inspire confidence that Robomoto couldn't get a game that looked like this running smoothly, even on the PS4 or Xbox One. Going into launch, you'd be forgiven if you didn't know that a new Tony Hawk game was even launching. It received very little marketing online or otherwise, and if you wanted to check out reviews when it came out in late September, you'd be excused if you couldn't find any. Activision opted not to send out review builds to any members of the press, which of course is an age-old tactic to mitigate poor reviews that could spoil day one sales. However, this had a blowback effect that might have done even more damage. Since critics and influencers couldn't get early code, they had to play or record videos during the public launch, and since that was a disaster in and of itself, with everyone hammering the always online aspect at once, reviews were even more harsh. Now it's time for the patch. When you started up the 5th Pro Skater, you would realize that the game barely existed. At launch, there was a mandatory almost 8 gig patch that was, for all intents and purposes, the game itself. The initial data for THPS 5 was around 4 gigs, and the patch was everything else. Robomoto had to slap this together so quickly, the game was divided into 2 really important chunks. If you chose not to get the patch, or if you just couldn't because your internet was out that day, you would only get access to the tutorial and park editor. All other modes and features were contained within that snug little 8 gigs. Not just that, but a variety of fixes were also included in the patch, things like improved textures, performance, and other things within the main game. But as many YouTube compilations pointed out, wasn't enough. The main issue that people had, however, was that since the main experience of Tony Hawk 5 was the always online aspect, and that barely worked for weeks, the game offered very little to even do for the most part. Not only that, the last gen versions were MIA weeks into the launch with no communication from Activision. It was only until October where it was admitted that both the PS3 and 360 versions might not even make 2015. In the standard robotic style of an Activision press release, they clarified, "We are always working closely with our developers to address the issues identified by our community. Our developmental resources are fully focused on fixes and content updates for PS4 and Xbox One, so we have decided to delay the full release of THPS 5 on PS3 and Xbox 360. We will update the community when we have more specific information." The last gen versions eventually wound up releasing just under the wire on December 15th. Digital only, by the way. Those versions also had no online functionality of any sort, hence why the game was $20 cheaper. God, what was even the point of these ports? Yeah, there were some funny character DLC cameos from whatever license Activision had at the time, and some really weird ones, but the damage was done. Despite each release Robomoto had under the belt with its Metacritic slowly rising, Pro Skater 5's various issues, delays, online woes, and just so many other things made it the worst reviewed major game released in 2015. Robomoto, with no other projects in the pipeline, closed the very next year. Then, in 2017, the servers for Tony Hawk 5 followed suit, and the game was then also delisted downloaded from digital stores. Now, if you owned a copy of it on the next-gen systems or found a physical version, you'd be shit out of luck, because all the online crap wouldn't even function. My god, this is some type of beautiful, awe-inspiring fresco of failure. 2018 followed 2017, as it tends to do, which is also the same year that Tony Hawk announced that he had split from Activision for good.
No shit.
And that there would no longer be any further entries in the Pro Series, and it's sad to say, but no one really seemed to lament that. While he couldn't use the name Pro Skater anymore, the Birdman was undaunted, and thus Tony Hawk's Skate Jam, not to be confused with Downhill Jam, was released for mobile phones, which turns out was incredibly bad. Critically, the touch-only interface was cited as unresponsive, despite the developer, Maple Media, having cut their teeth on multiple mobile skateboard games before this. This is probably one of the sadder tales to have ever been discussed here at What Happened, as it's really the first example of a once lauded, illustrious franchise being dragged through the mud again and again until it just couldn't go any longer. While skateboarding doesn't have that hot new thing hype any longer, the late 90s and early aughts were such an exciting time for the sport to both practitioners and casual admirers alike. It's up for debate if the Birdman will ever fly again on video game consoles, but probably not. If you know of any other video game wipeouts, tag your suggestions on the wall below or skate your way over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon to participate in future polls on the next subject we'll take on. See you next time, fellow kids, and thanks for watching.